Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for Module 21. This module is dealing with further aspects of harmonic vocabulary. So we're going to explore the use of what's called a 5 substitute 6 chord. We'll also explore how to use what's called a 5 augmented chord. And we'll talk about using chord extensions. And we will also explore the use of another kind of chord called a common tone diminished chord. So we'll start with this 5 or 5-7 with a substituted 6. And it's basically exactly what it sounds like. So a 6 can be added to a 5 chord by substituting that interval for the 5th of the chord. So because the 5th doesn't do a lot to really define the chord, right? We can often leave it out in our 4-part textures and things like that. We can add a little bit more color to a 5 chord in particular by switching that 5th out for a note that is a 6th above the bass. And so here's an example in the key of G major. And you see the first chord would be something like a 4-6, so a 4 chord in first inversion. The second chord is a 5 chord, but you can see that B is added to it. And B is not a 5th above the bass note D, it's a 6th above the bass note D. So this is what we would label a 5 substitute 6, okay? And then that resolves like a 5 should to a 1 chord. So it's just a way of adding a little bit of a different color to a dominant chord. The 6th is usually created and resolved by melodic motion from scale degree 2, 3, and 1. You can see that here we have the second scale degree A, moves up by step to create the 6th, and then that resolves weirdly by a leap down to the first scale degree. So one of the few dissonances that can resolve by leap. You can also use a 6th in a 5-7 chord, but because that would create a half step, you can't ever voice them in the same place. And often the 6th is added so that it is above the 7th of the chord. And so here we have a 2-5-1 progression in the key of E flat major. The first chord would be a 2 chord in root position. The second chord would be a 5 chord with a substituted 6, but it also has a 7th. So the 7th is in the tenor, and you can see the 6th is voiced above that in the soprano line. And so that would sound like this. Okay, so very nice, almost subtle kind of color to a 5 chord. Okay, and you can see that it's created in the same way. We have the second scale degree F to the third scale degree G, resolving down by leap to the first scale degree 1. All right, another thing you can do to elaborate or add some color to a 5 chord is to use it as a augmented triad, or a augmented triad with a 7th. So we'll label that as a 5+. And it's important to remember that that plus modifies the triad. It doesn't modify the 7th. So if you see like 5 plus 7, that doesn't mean we're augmenting the 7th. It always means we're augmenting the triad. So the 5th of the 5 chord can be raised a half step to create a 5 augmented chord. And here's an example in the key of D major. Again, it's another 2-5-1. And so you'll see that the 2 is creating the raised 5th scale degree in the second chord so that it becomes an A augmented triad. Okay, we label that as 5 plus 7 because there's also a 7th in that chord. So that would sound like this. Okay, so that raised 5th scale degree acts as kind of a chromatic passing tone from scale degree 2 through the chromatic note to scale degree 3, which is the third of our 1 chord. And so you can see that the E, right, is raised up a half step to become the E sharp, which is the raised 5th of that chord. And then that E sharp continues on to resolve to the F sharp to become the third of the 1 chord. And that's how that usually happens. So the 5th will often resolve to the third of a major 1 chord. But it's important to know that this never really happens with a minor 1 chord. And here's an example to show you why. So this is the same progression, but now it's written in the key of D minor. And you can see that the problem happens when we try to resolve that augmented triad, because that E sharp is the same note as the third of that minor triad, which now is not F sharp, but it's F natural. So because that's the same pitch, there's really no resolution. And so this raised fifth isn't something that is used as an anticipation, it's used as a chromatic passing tone. And since it's impossible to use it as an actual chromatic passing tone in this situation, it very rarely, if ever, resolves to a 1 minor chord. Okay, so the raised fifth scale degree acts as a chromatic passing tone that resolves to the third of a 1 major chord. And you can add a seventh as well. Okay, so that's 5 augmented and 5 augmented 7. Now let's look at something that's a little bit more common in other styles of music such as jazz, and that is chord extensions. And we'll spend a little bit more time on this when we're actually doing some composition exercises. But now let's just talk about the concept of a chord extension. So any chord, not just a dominant, can be given a chord extension by continuing to add thirds above the seventh of a chord. So here's all the possible extensions, and this is these are all written above the 5 chord in the key of A. You'll see that the first chord here just has a seventh added. We're pretty used to that. All right, so that creates a dominant 7th chord. But we can extend it, we can color it further by adding a third above that 7th, which is now the 9th of the chord. And we can keep going with this. We can add an 11th to the chord. And we can go up 1/3 further and add the 13th of the chord. Okay? Which is a very colorful chord, right? It has basically all the notes you can have, but they're all spread out by a third, so it still kind of sounds like a triad. Okay, now you can't add anything above the 13th, because if you kept going, the next note above that C sharp would be an E, and that's just the root of the chord again. So this is as far as you can go by adding thirds above the chord as extensions. Okay, so in this style of music, which is the music of 18th and 19th century musicians in Europe, the 9th is really the only commonly used chord extension. And the book says it's mostly found in music of the later 19th century, early 20th century, which might be true, I don't know. And it's usually added to add color to an already dissonant 5 chord. So that's what we'll really worry about right now. We'll talk about the other ones later. But for now, we'll just worry about how the 9th is added. So here's an example of a dominant chord with an added 9th. You can see that's another 2-5-1 progression, this time in the key of A. And you can see that the second chord in this progression has an F sharp in it, which is a 9th above the E. Okay? It's also a second, but when we're voicing these 9ths, right, they're always going to be above the 7th of the chord. So we don't really consider them seconds, we consider them an octave higher than a second, which is a 9th. And so this demonstrates what this sounds like. And you can see that, well, like I said, extensions are usually voiced above the 7th, which in this case it is. The 7th is D, so you want to voice the extension F sharp above that D. And just like a 7th, in this style of music, 9ths are usually created and resolved like a suspension. So that F sharp from our 2 chord is suspended, or in other words, repeated, and so it creates a dissonance with the 5, and then that dissonance resolves nicely down by step to the 5th of the 1 chord. And that's how 9ths usually introduced and resolved. 11ths are also like that, and a 13th is more like that 5 substituted 6, which we will talk about later. So a 13th will resolve down by a leap instead of a step. Okay, so that's chord extensions. Now it's important that You can have sort of chromatic modifications for chord extensions too. Like something can be a flat 9, and that just means it's the ninth of the chord. But instead of using the diatonic note, you would lower it by a half step, right? So same thing, you could have a flat 11, you could have a sharp 13, anything like that, so they can be altered as well. Okay. So finally, the last one is called a common tone diminished seventh chord. And this is simply a fully diminished seventh chord that shares a note with a chord that it embellishes, and that note is usually the root of that chord. And we're used to common tone diminished sevenths that act as the leading tone of a chord, but these are distinct. They do not do that because they don't have a note that is a half step below the root that they're leading to. So these don't work as leading tone seventh chords. We call them something else, a common tone diminished seventh. So here's an example. This is the key of C major, and you can see that we start with a 1 chord in second inversion, so a 1-6-4 chord. And you'll see that in the middle chord, it has an F sharp, a C, a D sharp, and an A, which is 2 tritones. It's also a stack of minor thirds, so that's a fully diminished chord. And the chord that follows it is the same 1-6-4 that we just had. But there's nothing in that middle chord that would lead to the root of that next chord, right? There's no B in this chord, so this is not a leading tone seventh chord like it should be. So what's happening is that C is in common between those two chords. So C is the root of the last chord, but it also exists in the fully diminished seventh chord. And so we have to consider this chord not functionally, like we don't consider it the harmonic function because it doesn't really have one. Instead, all the pitches of the chord that it's resolving to, that it's elaborating, are embellished by voice leading, so as chromatic lower neighbor tones. So that F sharp embellishes that G, that D sharp embellishes that E, and that A, actually is a diatonic neighbor tone, embellishes that G there. Okay, so the sound is this. So it doesn't really have a harmonic function, it just serves to kind of go chromatically below the notes of the next chord and then resolve those up. So we don't consider it to have a harmonic function, so we wouldn't label it as like 7 of 1 because it's not a 7 of 1. Instead, we just kind of put it in parentheses and say common tone diminished seventh chord because, you know, labeling harmonies doesn't really have sufficient language or the ability to really identify how this works because it doesn't work harmonically. It only works melodically. Okay, here's another example. So this is in the key of F, and we start with what looks like a 6 chord in root position. Then we proceed to a common tone diminished seventh chord, and it resolves to a 5/7 chord in the next bar. So you don't always have to start on the chord that you are elaborating, but you do have to finish on the chord that you are elaborating. And so it's the same idea. We have the 6 chord moving to a note where everything is some kind of elaboration of the chord that we're going to. So that F sharp chromatically leads to the G, the D sharp chromatically leads to the E, the A leads by step, actually it is a half step, to the B flat, and then the C is in common between those two chords because it's the root of the chord that we're elaborating. There you go. So in a lot of ways it's like a chromatic passing tone or chromatic neighbor tone, but they all just kind of happen at once. And so the book just makes the distinction that this should be considered some kind of special harmony. And so we'll go with that, but we'll just make sure that we know that it does not have a harmonic function. It's really just a bunch of chromatic embellishments of a chord that we're going to. This is a case of like voice leading being more prominent and something that should be identified more than the harmonic structure or harmonic function of the chord. Okay, So there you go, quick little rundown of some more harmonic topics. Yeah, so thanks for watching, and have a great day.